Okay, in this module, we're going to talk about a very important concept called comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is a big part of what's known as catallaxy, or the study of human interaction. And comparative advantage is brought to us by David Ricardo in 1817. Ricardo wanted to have free trade in England. If you remember from our discussion on the Laffer curve, that you didn't have free trade in England until 1860, after the death of 1 million Irish people in the potato famine. Ricardo realized England was a island nation, and therefore then needed to have free trade in agriculture goods in order to continue wealth creation. And so he came up with this concept of comparative advantage to argue for free trade. And this is what we'll be looking at now, to show, again, in a heuristic, how free trade helps everyone. And so we'll show that now. So in discussing comparative advantage, what Ricardo used was trade amongst Portugal and the UK as an example. But in catallaxy, we're worried about, or concerned about, hopeful about individuals. And trade is between individuals, not between nations, right? The nation state only gets in the way of trade. Trade is between individuals. So I've used Joe in Portugal and Nancy in the UK as examples. And here's our production possibility frontier. Joe in Portugal can produce 70 bolts of cloth or 40 barrels of wine. Nancy in the UK can produce and consume 100 bolts of cloth or 50 barrels of wine. And this is before trade. Here's our Keynesian equation. And this is before trade, or autarky. This is our starting point for analysis, is autarky, pre-trade between Joe and Nancy. Prior to trade, Joe produces and consumes 35 bolts of cloth and 20 barrels of wine. And Nancy has, you'll see here that Nancy has absolute advantage. Nancy in the UK can produce and consume more than Joe in Portugal. And this is a historical fact, because England, being an island nation, this is called the openness index. The openness index, the UK being a island nation, their percentage of trade, exports and imports, as percentage of the economy was greater than Portugal. So they were more open to technological progress, and therefore were much more efficient at production because they were more of an open economy. But this is prior to trade. Joe is consuming and producing 35 bolts of cloth and 20 barrels of wine. Nancy in the UK, 64 bolts of cloth and 18 bottles of wine. So let's look at the opportunity cost for Joe between cloth and wine. The opportunity cost for wine for Joe is, it takes 70 bolts of cloth to get 40 barrels of wine. So the opportunity cost is 7/4. The opportunity cost for wine for Joe in Portugal is 7/4. Therefore, the opportunity cost for cloth is 4/7. For Nancy, the opportunity cost is you have to give up. For Nancy, you have to give up 100 bolts of cloth to get 50 barrels of wine, or 2 is the opportunity cost. So therefore, the opportunity cost for cloth for Nancy is 1/2. You'll see that 7/4 is less than 2. So Joe in Portugal has the comparative advantage in wine production, which makes sense if you more amenable to growing wine in Portugal than it is in the UK. And then Nancy has a comparative advantage in cloth production. And this makes historical sense because industrialization started with cloth production in England, and England had a technological advancement because of their openness. So this is the situation before trade. Now you no longer have autarky, and you're allowing trade. So once you start allowing trade, what happens? Through catalactic exchange, people start realizing their comparative advantage in trade with each other. And this comparative advantage can only be realized through exchange. And, right? So what's going to happen then when you have exchange? People are going to focus on what their comparative advantage is. And so therefore, because Joe has a comparative advantage in wine, Joe's going to produce all wine. Nancy's going to produce all cloth, and then they're going to trade with each other. Nancy's going to trade, makes 100 cloth, trades 35, and keeps 65. Joe's going to trade 19 wine and keep 21 wine. So now you'll see that the production possibility frontier is pushed out without doing anything except production possibility and consumption frontier is pushed out without doing anything at all except trade. Nancy's now 65 and 19. So you'll see that Nancy's production possibility frontier is pushed out farther than Joe's is because Nancy had more talent. Nancy had absolute advantage. So this can explain why the rich get richer under the market, but also the poor get richer under the market. Only the rich get richer quicker. So without doing anything except trading, both parties gain. And this is a one-time gain. And what is missing from this analysis is this the specialization of labor. As Joe focuses on wine and Nancy focuses on cloth, they get better and better at it. Their learning curve goes down over time and quantity production, and more wealth is created due to the specialization of labor, the extent of the market, accumulation of capital, investment in labor-saving devices, and more trade. Again, trade and the market leading to wealth creation. And again, this idea of comparative advantage falls under the category of Cadillacsy, which is the study and science of exchange. Thank you. This concludes our module on comparative advantage.